White privileged individuals discount and devalue my work. So I assumed this was from a person of color, someone who's indigenous. They devalue my contributions. And now I'm no longer focusing on whites. I'm done. I added the I'm done part. So now I focus on my job tasks. However, it becomes very hard to work without the assistance of everyone else. And everyone else, the white folks, seem to have a lot of support, and I'm not getting that support. How do I continue to work, not take on the burden of educating white folks, but also have the reasonable relationships and support to get my work done? My hope is some of the answers that I gave on the previous one, which is that we're damned if we do, damned if we don't, and we want recognition for everything we're trying. So in this one, it is exhausting, and for whites who are listening, I hope you know and continue to get deeper understanding of how exhausting it is for folks of color to continue to do their job, to deal with all the dynamics of race in an organization that is their second and third job that's unpaid. And then to have whites come up to them and either ask them questions or ask them to help on something. I just heard a story recently, senior white leader, well-intended, told the story about when they were well-intended and a much younger person of color gave some critique. And the senior leader said, that's a great idea. You're right. What we wrote was not very useful. Would you be willing to give it a draft and help us do this? Now, in the moment, she thought it was a great idea. And I'm sure I've done something like that before, not realizing how we whites ask folks of color to take on tasks, jobs, projects that we're not yet competent to do. And yet we should be, because it's our job to be racially literate as well as everything else. So that's step one. And the thing is, if folks of color are not taking care of us, if they are not teaching us, then we hold it against them. I'm not saying blatant punishment, but there are all kinds of subtle ways, gossip, all kinds of ways that some whites, if not most whites, will get back at folks of color if they don't collude and go along to keep us supportive, comfortable, protected in our fragility. So as I mentioned earlier, I think training for whites is critical. You may want to, again, do racism for everyone, but then have similar energy and time invested in folks in the privileged group as well as the marginalized group about dynamics of racism and policies, practices, interpersonal, and clearly affinity spaces for whites. One other thing that I haven't mentioned is this dynamic is within a team. And so I want to know the supervisors, how much training are they getting around developing an inclusive work environment with a race lens, common dynamics of racism, the cumulative impact on people of color, of racist microaggressions, policies that are not inclusive, and then this overburdening, what I hear many people of color talking about, the overtax, the race tax of all the things that people of color take on because no one else is doing it. It's impacting people they care about, people they're serving, impacting them. And so it's a skill gap in the leaders and the supervisors, mostly white would be my guess. So what is your development for supervisors? How do you create an inclusive, racially just work environment? How do you create racially just, inclusive programs, policy, services? And then some work around navigating triggers. So that might be, that's the first book up there, Turn the Tide. And so you can get online either from my work or other people's work. It might be interesting for the whole department to get some work on what are your common triggers, hot buttons, how do you respond? How do you react sometimes when you're triggered? How would you like us to respond if we think we noticed you're a little out of sorts? That can be a great team building strategy. In this specific situation, this group might be farther along than that will work, and yet it might be useful. Another approach to this one is just training your supervisors about how to do good retreats when your team is not as high producing, high performing, inclusive as it needs to be. And giving them some skills about panning group dynamics with an inclusion lens, common microaggressions, how to have people create learning guidelines collectively and reflect how well are we treating each other with respect and dignity and supporting each other and helping each other out and listening deeply and all those good ones that are in workshops. You can then take those, have the group say, when do you work at your best? What is the ideal team for you to give your best performance? So the person that wrote this in would probably say things like that I have colleagues, particularly white, who notice racist microaggressions, interrupt them, who are reaching out across race to build relationships and not expecting the folks of color to be the ones that are initiating everything, and whites that coach other whites who have not yet realized that their behavior has a negative impact for folk of color in the organization as well as those we're supposed to be serving. So it would give people a chance, especially if you let them put it in anonymously. So surveys or focus groups, depending on how big your organization is, can be really powerful ways to get some more information. I like focus groups because if there are, say, 5 folk of color and they're willing to come to focus group, then no one of them is assumed to have said anything, and you get the patterns of concerns. Plus, whites might also raise a similar pattern. So I don't say people of color said this, white said this. I said these were the dynamics that came out of the focus groups. I'd also give a chance for people to send in written comments because they may even, a group of whites, like, I'm not saying this in front of. And then you just filter that down to make sure it's generic and themed as opposed to people's words. You can share that back with a team. Those are some of my thoughts. This one situation seemed more group conflict was going on, and those interventions are different from the foundational trainings or even racism trainings, and yet those can be useful to get people the solid foundation of privilege, marginalized, microaggressions, I need to speak up, before then you move into the conflict. How do we navigate real conflict that we're having?